Welcome everyone this morning, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to be able to moderate this panel and to hear what I expect will be an absolutely fascinating debate from 4 different perspectives, not just 2, on what is one of the key debates, I understand, for many people in the aid community about ODA versus DFI funding. It's something I learned a lot about as I was preparing for this panel, and I'm really looking forward to each side convincing us of their points, of the strong points, the weaknesses that really are all about, as you know far better than me, helping the most vulnerable communities in the world and the people who need this most in the most effective way to bring aid to them. Obviously, I want to introduce our panelists before I give you a little bit more of an overview and go any further. First of all, we have Chang. I can just give you a brief overview, everyone, because you know them better than I do. She, of course, was the former Chief Innovation Officer at USAID. She is an expert in the impact and scale of global developments, where she ran a special development lab at USAID looking at ways to innovate aid. She also has a background in Silicon Valley, places like Google, in senior engineering roles, so a very smart lady. We have Étienne Grall here as well. He's the Director of Corporate Responsibility for Export Development Canada. And there he has actually been tasked with leading the team that has designed the Development Finance Institute, which is one of the issues we're debating here tonight when we're talking, or today, pardon me, when we're talking about TFIs. So he certainly is an expert in how Canada is bringing this about. He's been working in aid throughout his career, starting out in development aid financing in Europe, and he's going to bring that excellent perspective here today. Robert Greenhill, Executive Chairman at the Global Canada Initiative. He's the previous Managing Director and Chief Business Officer at the World Economic Forum, a man about town of Ottawa. I'm sure many of you know him and are very familiar with his work. And Runa, Osili, who is an economist. She is a professor of economics and the Associate Dean of Research and International Programs at Indiana University's Lilly School of Philanthropy. And she is an expert in the economics of aid. So we're going to get 4 fantastic perspectives here, and we look forward to having them. Before we start and ask each of the panelists to give us their background on this, I just want to highlight some of the key issues that we're looking at today. One of those, of course, is Agenda 2030. It's a very ambitious agenda, and there's a lot of questions about whether or not it can be met. There's also the feminist foreign policy that the government has been advocating, saying that they are encouraging, that they are performing, that they are directing aid towards. How does what we're discussing today fit into that? Is Canada capable of meeting its development goals? And what roles do ODI and DFI funding play in allowing the people who need that money most to get it? What about corporate responsibility in all of this? Lots of questions here today. And without further ado, I'm going to start with Anne, who's going to present us with her perspective on the issue.
My pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. This is an exciting topic because, as you all know, we're living in a very tumultuous time when it comes to global development and foreign aid. Certainly in my country, in the US, there's been lots of debate, and I know there is here as well. I just want to share a couple sort of scene-setting data points that I think you're all familiar with, but just to motivate some of the discussion. If you can bring up the slide. Two data points. One is that with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that we signed up for a couple years ago, we know that we're $2 to $3 trillion short of what is needed to finance achieving the SDGs on the track that we're on today. We also know, if you look at this graph here, the red is ODA, and the darker color beige is private funding flows, and then the lighter color there is domestic resources or domestic taxes. And so if you look at over the last 20 years, whereas foreign aid used to dominate the financial flows to developing countries, today private investment is 10 times as much. And local government investment is 4 times greater even than that. And so if you add all this up, foreign aid accounts for only about 2% of financing in developing countries. And so if we think about the gap in the SDGs and we think about foreign aid as being such a small percentage of the financing going in, my conclusion is twofold. One is that we need better solutions, and we need to figure out how to better leverage this additional 98% of funding that's happening. And so what I would say that means from an ODA perspective is that aside from, if we just set aside kind of humanitarian aid and relief, which of course we will continue need to fund through foreign aid and emergency assistance, and focus on the core of development, I would say there's two things that we need to focus on for foreign aid: innovation and being more catalytic. On the innovation side, I think there's, one of the themes of the conference is something we've talked about a lot, but I think there's a misunderstanding a lot of times on innovation. I think when we hear the word innovation, we often gravitate towards the flashy new gadgets. And I think that's, certainly a piece of innovation, but a small piece of innovation. One of my favorite quotes is from Edison, that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Those great ideas are that 1% and absolutely essential, but the 99% are the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into testing, validating, iterating, continuing to improve those ideas to make them have business models, really have the impact that we're looking for, and so forth, in order to reach the ultimate impact that we're seeking. And what that means is, from a foreign aid perspective, is that we need to move away from the traditional way that we design programs of 3 to 5 years with a grand master plan up front that we then just execute on, and move instead towards a model where we are really testing out a lot more ideas, have clear and continuing to increase performance characteristics, outcomes and impacts that we're trying to achieve. We should also always be shooting for looking at how we can continue to stretch to deliver more for less. And we need to figure out how to build in data feedback loops so that we can constantly have the data that tells us how we're doing and continue to challenge ourselves to do better. And that's how we drive innovation, sort of incentivize innovation to deliver better solutions. Better solutions are certainly not going to be enough. We also need to have more sustainable and significant funding, and that's where the catalytic side comes in. And we think about, the reason we want to be catalytic is we want to reach much greater scale. If we think about the kinds of challenges that we're trying to tackle, there's usually something on the order of 1 billion people who need whatever it is. And so when we reach 1 million people, that's like 0.1% of the need. And so to really look at scaling to the size of the need, one of the shifts in framework I think we need to think about is, instead of thinking about scale as an absolute number, we scaled to 100,000 people or 1 million people, we should think about scale as exponential growth, which means what's the slope of the curve? How are we getting to getting to more and more people over time? And the only way to do that, with ODA being only 2% of the financing, we're not going to do that through ODA, except for very targeted areas such as vaccines, where there's been a huge global commitment. But for most areas, we're going to need to figure out how to catalyze private sector financing as well as local government investments. And to do that, we need to design those in from the very beginning, not design programs that will be funded through foreign aid, but design programs that look at how do we engage the private sector, how do we engage local governments through the mechanisms that work for them, so that they can carry these types of interventions forward in a much more scalable and sustainable way than we can through foreign aid.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. Étienne, go ahead.
Good morning, bonjour. Thank you very much to CCIC for organizing this panel on a topic that indeed creates a lot of interest and debate. Thank you for Aga Khan for hosting us here too. I'm really at the, Anne's previous curve looks like our learning curve, and we're still at the bottom of it. My role is simply put to launch an organization, a brand new organization, to achieve development impact through the private sector in developing countries. Simply put, a development finance institution. This term has been bandied around, but not necessarily fully understood. What I'd like to give you is just a little bit of a flavor of what are the challenges that we're facing and how we're approaching them. First of all, the challenges, there is something that I call the development finance paradox, is that there's huge needs out there and everyone says, well, it's amazing, how much we can do if we mobilize the private sector. The challenge from a development finance institution's perspective, which has a public policy mandate to achieve development impact, but also not to crowd out the private sector, is that the niche that it can potentially occupy is very narrow. I won't spend too much time on that, but depending on the country, the sector, the type of segment that you want to target, there is no obvious gaping hole waiting for you. So there's no, Canada is a late starter in this idea, and many of you in this room have contributed to the debate. It's not that the world has waited for Canada to create a DFI. There's a nice chair with our name on it, and drop your bag here, and this is a great space for you. It's something that we're going to have to work hard for to find where is going to be our positioning. The second thing is that, of course, as we embark on this work to create a Canadian DFI, we've looked at what others are doing. And there are lots of really interesting recipes out there, but there is no winning model. There's not one organization that everyone looks to and says, yeah, this is the one you need to emulate. Most organizations do a number of things well, and most of them have done mistakes. I've met with practically all the existing DFIs, and all of them have said, hey, we'd love to be in your shoes. We'd love to be able to start with a blank slate without our baggage, but with our knowledge. Because we would be able to start anew and not do the mistakes we've done. And of course, I ask, what are those mistakes that you've done? And the answer that you get to this is not usually as forthcoming as you would expect. A lot of learning, but not easy to extract that learning. And the last challenge I'll point to is there are so many priorities. So the DFI is now becoming the new initiative on the international assistance portfolio in Canada. And we've met a lot of you, we've met a lot of stakeholders, both in Canada and outside. And I can tell you it's a daunting task for us because there are lots of expectations and interests layered over this organization. And if you add to this, the SDGs, so Agenda 2030, climate change imperatives, and the international assistance policy and the focus on gender, that's a lot of different priorities we need to look at and digest and turn into an organization that makes sense. How are we doing this? Partner and seek ideas from others. So we are spending a lot of time understanding how, as I was mentioning earlier, other DFIs have done things right and trying to emulate those elements. There is an inherent challenge in learning from others, and we've talked about innovation, it's great to learn from others, but you can't just be a follower. And there would be a very comfortable zone for us to go and go where the others DFIs go. But we also heard this, even though DFIs are increasingly seen as an important tool and in the public funding toolbox, there's a fair amount of criticism layered to them. Too slow, too bureaucratic, not risk, too risk averse. So the challenge for us is to take those good recipes and turn that into potential for innovation. What does innovation mean for us? Because we've identified this as a key driver and aspiration. Hard to answer, but as you were saying, Anne, innovation is not necessarily a great big bang and a flashy thing. It's about doing things slightly differently, even at a small scale, but demonstrating that certain things can work that had not been tested before. And where we think we bring a lot of expertise to the table as Export Development Canada is the breadth of of financial expertise and structuring expertise and notion of risk transfer and sharing risks, etc., which is very topical to the notion of catalyst, and we'll come back to that in our discussion, I'm sure. So learn from others. Also, a very common thing that we've heard, one of the keys to success, place development impact objectives at the core of your organization. It is interesting that we've heard from many that DFIs don't do that as much as you'd think they do. So we're currently working on, first, developing our own development impact scorecard, and we're still in this process, so I'll be able to give you maybe some flavor of what we're looking at, and making it very inherent to the decision making and the activities of everyone in the organization. And the third key to success, and I'll close on this, is I was mentioning, the layers of priorities and different issues we could address is focus, focus, focus. And this is going to be probably the hardest thing for us to do, because there's a lot of pent-up demand for this tool, and there's a lot of expectations of what it will do, and everyone would like to have a piece of the action. So I hate to disappoint you here, and it's to the broader community out there, is that we won't be able to do everything to all people, and we're in the process, working with the Government of Canada, to identify, at least in its first years of activity, where is the DFI going to focus on? The learning from other organizations, even much larger ones than the one that we're aspiring to build, is you need to pick areas where you can build bench strength, expertise, so that you can truly be effective there. So if you try to pepper your activity around the world, all sectors, all geographies, it's not going to work. So I'll close on this, and just with one message that developing a successful organization will take time. We certainly anticipate to have the ingredients of success right from the get-go, but the DFI will grow slowly. And my recommendation, actually, as lead for this project, is to make sure that we don't rush into things too fast, and make sure that we build the right organization for Canada, and we build it with the right partnerships around this room and beyond.
All right, Robert, love to hear your perspective next.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And first of all, I just like to commend Étienne and the EDC, because the Export Development Corporation is one of the hidden strategic tools for Canada's global engagement. I mean, it's a world-class institution that actually makes a positive return on its assets while facilitating thousands of Canadians to do billions of dollars of exports every year. So, in all the other challenges of this, I think we chose the right place to house it in terms of what we're doing with the DFI. Now, let's talk about kind of the private sector versus ODA. And obviously, coming as a businessman myself, I have a strong belief in the powerful role the private sector can play for good in certain circumstances. It can create jobs, it can provide services and goods, it can provide a tax base, and is critical to economic development. At the same time, it has three really important limitations. One is it's profit maximizing. So any investment has to come back with a return. Secondly, it's risk adverse. So when things go bad in areas, money tends to leave and actually tends to exacerbate economic crises in developing countries. Third is it's least suitable where the need is greatest. So there are lots of places where the private sector can play a very important role in lower middle income countries and infrastructure and other areas critical. But if you're looking at the 65 million internally displaced people and refugees, the 850 million people who are going hungry, countries in or just coming out of conflict, fragile states, the least developed countries. These are places that have a massive crying immediate need for the vaccinations, for the primary health care, for education, for rule of law. These are not communities that can afford to finance these privately, right? And there's no catalytic approach that is actually going to provide millions of people with basic health care and basic education. You can have innovations within it, but it requires significant heavy lifting. And so in addition to the humanitarian side, there are cases where the catalytic approach is important, like DFID supporting M-Pesa, which was the first example of kind of cellular banking, and where that was a catalytic role. But in many other places, in a sense, the Elon Musk analogy would be more on his spaceship program, where actually ODA provides the booster rockets. It does the heavy lifting to help the most fragile, vulnerable, poverty, and conflict-stricken societies get to a takeoff point where some of these elements can actually, including the private sector, play a more important role. And there's therefore a complementary and sequential role that these play. And in many societies, official development assistance is critical. If you look at Rwanda over the last 20 years, to help the societies rebuild, to finance the basic education, to finance the healthcare, to finance the institutional infrastructure that then allows the private sector and other sources to play an important role. And in fact, one of the best examples of this is China, because we always look at China as the great example of not exactly private sector, given its state-owned enterprises, but market economic-driven growth. And it's very much the case today. But we often forget that just a generation ago, China was the world's largest recipient of official development assistance, over $20 billion of assistance. And Canada's engagement in China goes through that, where we actually started with providing food aid 30 years ago. And then we were very involved in helping improve the agricultural productivity and reforestation programs. We were involved in helping them build their universities. Thousands of Chinese students came to Canada on CETA scholarships and other mechanisms. We were involved in helping them with their critical national institutions. And over time as well, we became very involved in the business side. So over the last 20 years, China went from being our second largest recipient of official development assistance from Canada to being the second largest market for our goods and services. And that's as it should be. There is a sequence and a complementarity of these approaches. But let's look at today. Today, there is a massive crying unmet need for official development assistance. It has gotten off the radar screen because it's no longer a sexy topic. In places like the United States, the president is talking about not being in the business of nation building, but more in the business of nation breaking. I mean, if you go into Afghanistan and you think missiles alone will do the job, it's folly. There needs to be a mix of the breaking, the bandaging, but also the building. Official development is a critical component of that building, not just catalytic, but heavy lifting for those societies in need. And we're in danger of losing those places and having them fall back. We're seeing this in Afghanistan, we're seeing this in the Sahel, we're seeing this in other areas. We're seeing this with donor fatigue in things like infectious diseases, where insecticide-resistant malaria strains and other areas may actually break out because we're not putting in the ODA to get the job done. So in this mix, we need to make sure we have the balance right and we do the investment in the ODA to allow these other tools to be most effective. Unfortunately, Canada in the last 20 years has been involved in a silent surrender of its leadership role in this. Our official development assistance today is barely half the level of it was for decades before. So when we're looking at the role we can be playing, we absolutely need an all-of-the-above approach, but ODA still and for the foreseeable future is a central part of that. Thank you.
Already support for one side here. Wait, hold your horses. Okay, let's hear from Runa.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to join this great debate, as it's termed. I'm here to add a slightly different perspective, but an important perspective. My main point here this morning is that the global development landscape has changed significantly over the last 2 decades, certainly since my time as a graduate student, or even before that. A closer look at economic engagement with developing countries over the past decade and how it's changed further demonstrates the importance of private financial flows. One area that has not received as much attention, I don't know if we can put up the slide, is the role of private philanthropy in the international arena. The Index of Global Philanthropy and Remittances, which is now housed at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, measures total economic engagement, including official development assistance, private philanthropy, remittances, which we haven't heard much about this morning so far, as well as private capital flows. This approach offers a more complete picture of a country's total engagement with the developing world and takes into account the critical role that the private sector plays in the developing world. So according to the 2016 Index of Global Philanthropy and Remittances, which is the most recent data that we have, total government aid from the US and 38 other countries to the developing world was about $147 billion in 2014, while private flows of capital investments, remittances, and philanthropy was $801 billion, more than 5 times official development assistance. So this includes about $513 billion in private capital flows such as foreign direct investment, $224 billion in remittances, and $64 billion in private philanthropy. Private philanthropy today accounts for about 7% of these countries' total engagement with developing countries. Over the past decade, new forms of philanthropy have emerged. So today we have impact investments, crowdfunding, and the private sector taking a large and visible role in global development. What's very interesting from my perspective is the rise of collaboration between large-scale donors, governments, foundations, NGOs, businesses, but also increasingly social enterprises, civil society organizations. These offer possibilities and new possibilities for improving lives for billions of people around the globe. So when we think of philanthropy, this includes both large-scale donors as well as small donors because of crowdfunding platforms. And these flows jointly are fueling scientific advances or serving as a catalyst for research in new areas, as well as programmatic advances in health, education, the environment, and other key sectors. When we look around across the developing world today, we're seeing private philanthropy also catalyzing innovation in service delivery. You heard about whether it's bed nets in malaria endemic regions or delivering global health solutions in HIV/AIDS, malaria, as well as female empowerment and education of young people. So as we think about what are the threats today to those private flows, the International Center for Nonprofit Law identified 4 common challenges restricting the operation of international development NGOs globally. These constraints include restrictive legal requirements for registration and operation of nonprofits, restrictions on foreign funding and affiliations, and overly broad counterterrorism laws that actually restrict international development work, as well as the lack of trust between government and nonprofits. At the Lilly Family School, one of the projects that I lead is a project called the Index of Philanthropic Freedom that looks at the increasing scrutiny that these private philanthropic flows face. For example, in about 20 countries, we've seen that specific laws and regulations towards foreign nonprofits have been passed or proposed since 2015. And the increasing level of oversight towards foreign nonprofits has the potential to constrain philanthropic freedom globally, and also to limit the ability of philanthropy to fuel innovation and provide risk capital to address global challenges. We can look at many of these same policies and how they affect the flow of remittances to developing countries. So I think in closing, one of my big points and challenges to add to this debate is that we need to look at all of the flows to developing countries, not just ODA, not just foreign direct investment, but also remittances and private philanthropy, and see the specific role that each of these flows add to the development debate and how we can create an enabling environment that can foster many of these flows, because each one has a role to play in the global development conversation. So I'll stop here and open it up for debate.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you. It's fascinating. Really appreciate it. So for our audience, we have a few segments coming up, so you know what's happening. First of all, I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions each. I'll keep it brief because I think the really interesting segment comes after that, when they get to ask each other questions. And try to really drill down on this. And of course, we're also taking questions from the audience later, so if you have one, please submit it on the app. We're going to look for the ones that are trending towards the top, and those will be posed to our panelists as well. You may have noticed that there's not a clear delineation here. Even though we're calling it the Great Debate, we haven't asked people to take an artificial position for the purposes of having a debate. We're trying to really get into the depth of the issue here and the complexity, and it's not as simple as private versus public. There's remittances, as we heard, which I certainly had never thought about as a form of aid until I started to look into this before this panel. There's so many different ways of doing this, but it seemed like what we were consistently hearing is there's simply not enough aid. Whether it's private, whether it's public, there is a serious shortage. There are so many people who need help. So, Robert, I'm going to start with you and pick on you first, since you got the applause there. When you're looking at all this information and you're seeing the massive shortage, why do you believe that the government aid would still be a better way to perhaps increase it than a private aid? Why do you think it's more effective, that it's targeting people better, or is that not really the question?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think you actually, across the arc of development, you need all these different instruments, all these different sources. I guess my point would be official development assistance is irreplaceable as the way to help those most in need, least capable of financing themselves or obtaining private financing as an alternative. So if we're looking at the rebuilding of places that have been wrought by conflict, or if we're looking in the Sahel region of Africa, the private sector is not going to be able to provide the finance that official development assistance can, for example, in a place like Niger or Mali. And one of the debates is, well, it's only 2% of the $7 trillion. But that's a whole fruit basket of apples, pears, and oranges in there. It's a little bit like in Canada, we recently had the new child benefit, which is a $23 billion program to help families with the poorest families with children. And that $23 billion is only about 2% of earned income in Canada. So you could say, well, actually, it's only 2%. What does it matter? Well, actually, to those poorest families, the $5,000 or $6,000 a year per child has a massive impact. We estimate it will reduce child poverty in Canada by as much as 40%. So that 2% intervention has a 40% impact on the ones who need it most. Similarly, official development assistance isn't going to be applied to developing countries like the Chinas, the Indias, or the Indonesias, or even the Vietnams increasingly now. But to those who need it the most, it is absolutely irreplaceable. So that's why I see it, and that's why I talk about it as being the booster rocket for development, right? Now, it doesn't get you to the moon. That's where you need these other things.
And Annie, yeah, absolutely. I'd like you to respond to that.
Yeah, if I can jump in there, I 100% agree that ODA and foreign aid is an essential part of the mix. I think there's no disagreement on that on this panel. But I'm not sure that we're using ODA always in the most effective way. And so I see a lot of programs still where we are trying to deliver services on an ongoing basis through ODA, which are dramatically subscaled to the need. And so when I see that, what I ask is we could better leverage that ODA by using it rather than deliver sort of conservative, services in the way that we've always done them before, to find better solutions that can be far more effective. So in your example in Canada, that 2% is serving the need that is here. So that's great, and I'm very supportive of that. Similar to kind of our programs on vaccines, but where foreign aid is actually being deployed in ways that are dramatically subscaled to the need, we're not going to get $2 to $3 trillion more a year in foreign aid. So how are we going to make up that gap? That gap's going to be made up by taking the risk with foreign aid, because I think the private sector is not going to take that risk, especially when it comes to serving the bottom of the pyramid, working in fragile states and so forth. But foreign aid can. So taking that risk to find those better solutions, which includes finding business models that will allow those things to scale. And one of the things I haven't heard from the other panelists on about as much, which I think is also critical, is not just catalyzing private investment, but also local government investment, which is often spent in ways that are very ineffective. And I think between the two of those, we could just more effectively spend the ODA that we have to fill the gaps that others can't, right? Which is local governments often aren't in the position to take risks and experiment and find better solutions. And the private sector often isn't focused in those places because it's not clear yet that there's going to be a private sector upside. And that's where I think ODA has the most unique role to play.
Étienne, I want to ask you, you're a trade organization that's now wading into aid. And we're hearing all of these different priorities. They say if you have 100 priorities, you have no priorities. How do you determine what the priorities are for an organization like yours to make it effective, and what partners you're going to work with to justify the money that this new organization is receiving?
Actually, this organization is not receiving new money. It's being capitalized by EDC out of its own capital. So it's, as I say, this is a turnkey, free of charge project for the government of Canada. But this is just a detail. First, Canada is a trade organization. Thank you for the plug, but and that was unagreed to. the key thing is that EDC has been picked not for its trade capabilities, but for its financial capabilities. The development focus is completely new. It's a new mandate that we're given. It's absolutely not subject or subordinated to the trade mandate. So that's the starting point. How are we going to find those priorities? Considering we don't have a huge amount of money, $300 million of capital sounds like a lot of money, but it's a tiny drop in the bucket. So what we're looking at is, first, of course, look at the overarching priorities of the Government of Canada under Agenda 2030 and the Feminist International Assistance Policy and see, okay, of these priorities and areas of focus of the Government of Canada, what is relevant to working through the private sector? And that's the key thing here, is that our mandate is to work through the private sector in developing countries. So we need to develop our own sets of priorities and metrics that make sense to what the private sector needs in developing countries. How do we do this? It's a work in progress. Where we're focusing, of course, is on areas where Canada has some capabilities to bring to bear. So let me be very clear, the DFI is not tied to any Canadian interest. However, it would be foolish for Canadian DFI to go into spaces where Canada has no know-how. So we're trying to match the needs and the priorities of the international policy with the know-how, the collective know-how of Canada, both in terms of geographic presence and sector presence. And what's coming out of this is some areas where we think we need to focus, regions where we think we need to focus, and sectors. The key, and I can't answer this question specifically, but the key is for us, in order to be effective in developing countries in the private sector, is that you need to know where you step. Doing business as you all know, doing business in developing countries is fraught with challenges, and you can do a lot make a lot of stupid decisions. So we want to bring to bear the collective experience of Canada, not just the government, not just EDC, but also civil society and business, to see where do we have a better handle on how business gets done in those countries, a better identification of the needs, and go there. So in our preliminary thinking, for example, the Americas, so Latin America and the Caribbean, and the areas of higher poverty in those regions are areas that we're going to focus on. In terms of sectors, climate change and green growth in general, which is a key theme for the Government of Canada, is going to be an area of focus, as will the whole agribusiness, nutrition, rural development set of issues. If you take those two already, you have a huge set of priorities. That's where we're going to start.
Una, I want to ask you a question that comes to mind with a lot of the recent events we've seen. Natural disasters, hurricanes, affecting so many areas that are already struggling. When we talk about things like remittances and private aid flows, how responsive are those to natural disasters like the ones we've seen recently?
It's a great question, because this is really where some of the arguments about the role of the private sector come in. What we've seen over the past decade is that private flows are highly responsive to these sort of natural disasters, whether those are hurricanes, floods, earthquakes. The private sector is nimble in a way that government aid cannot, and can move quickly to those countries in need. What we have not seen is that when it comes to maybe man-made disasters such as civil war, the private sector is less able to respond to those sorts of threats. So there's clearly a role for both. We've also seen over the past 2 decades that remittances are counter-cyclical. In other words, when there's an economic downturn, we actually see remittances increase, whereas private sector flows, foreign direct investment, may retreat when a country is having a more difficult economic time. What has been particularly interesting for us is looking at the flows, the private sector flows from foundations, corporations, and so forth. These work very differently from official development assistance, where they are actually responding not just just to the incidence of a disaster, but also to the severity. So more severe disasters tend to receive more humanitarian relief from the private sector, whereas ODA tends to respond, I think Robert alluded to this, to more man-made, civil war, those kinds of disasters. So there's clearly a very different role for these different kinds of flows, but I think what's important for those of us who are thinking about global development at a very large scale is how we can provide an enabling environment so that both types, the private sector and the public sector, can play an important role.
Okay, well, I want to keep us on time here, so I'm going to move to the next segment of allowing the panelists to ask each other questions. So if anyone has a burning question for a fellow panelist who wants to volunteer to go first. Otherwise, I'm going to assign it.
Well, I'll start. And private flows of aid. Remittances is a very interesting topic for Canada because there's very strong flows, and it's certainly something that we're looking at. But remittances typically go from community to community. You know, it goes to either my family, my community, and there's a lot of grassroots private aid flows that go to what I know. I'll go to, give to that region or that area because I know someone there, etc. Is that the right way to prioritize? Can it create good intentions but not good outcomes type of situations? What role can other organizations play in prioritizing these flows? And is it even something doable? Or is it counterproductive? Because when you start to direct what is a natural flow, you undermine the effectiveness of it.
Remittances are perhaps the most interesting from a development perspective. They've been hailed as the new development finance, the new way to finance development. Why? Because they leverage personal ties. So when remittances flow, one of the things I try to kind of correct is that there are really three types of remittances. They're lumped together, but there are three distinct types. They're the family-based remittances that flow from one family, perhaps here in Canada, to another family in the developing world. But there are also investment flows. Migrants here in Canada and elsewhere are investing in small-scale SMEs in developing countries, but also all kinds of other capital investments. I was just in Nigeria last week, and on the plane coming back, several of the migrants I just happened to be sitting with were discussing the investment projects they had started in Nigeria. So remittances we don't often think of as capital, but they can be. And then finally, we have these community-based transfers where migrants are investing in development projects in their villages, in their hometowns, and in their communities more broadly. All three are important, but I think because we've kind of lumped them together, we haven't been able to unpack their role. And in some countries, some developing countries, I think are starting to develop policies to harness the development potential of remittances. So you might know Mexico has the Tres por Uno program where hometown associations that send development-related remittances are matched 3 for 1. Many countries now have those matching funds in place so that they can attract those sort of community-based remittances. So I think when we think about remittances and designing policies to harness their development potential, we may want to truly unpack them to better understand what each of them can play. I think your second point is one that's important. Are these always effective, especially if they're linked more to people's emotions or people's social ties and not necessarily targeted towards effective projects? I think we can make the same argument about ODA. Is it effective or not? One perhaps important point is that alongside the flows to international development projects is a new interest in measuring and tracking the evaluation. So you have a website called givewell.org that actually hosts randomized evaluations of programs like BedNet programs, water programs, female empowerment programs, to see if they're having the desired impact. So as donors give, they can look alongside the data on whether these projects actually have outcomes. It's interesting that most of the advance has been in the area of global health, but also in education. So philanthropists, both large scale and small scale, can look at the data on effectiveness, not just give where perhaps their heartstrings are being tugged, but also to where their dollars, Canadian dollars, American dollars, other currencies can have the greatest impact.
One of the elements that I think is very important on this idea of evaluation and learning, because it also builds on this issue of how do we catalyze our engagement and how do we both provide insights or perspectives where we have them, but also learn as well. Because one of the things that's been most striking for me over the last decade is how much of the most exciting economic and social political innovations actually been taking place in developing countries, often supported by official development assistance. So of course there was a green revolution, but the whole concept of social entrepreneurship really came out of Bangladesh. And BRAC and Grameen were actually supported by official development and assistance and many Canadian NGOs for decades. And they became a real sort of ground zero for these concepts. A lot of the really interesting innovations in individualizing healthcare and actually shifting it from being an issue of the patient seeing the doctor when sick to wellness, preventative, frontline healthcare programs took place in Africa because of necessity. The institutions aren't there. There aren't the doctors and there aren't the hospitals. So how do you keep people healthy? Because you can't help them when they're too sick. And so when I was at the World Economic Forum, one of the things we did with the top the Kaiser family in the insurance company and various pharmaceuticals companies and others was actually look at the reverse innovation in terms of what was the learning coming out of Africa in particular that was relevant for healthcare systems around the world. And so I think that's one of the really important things to be doing, to make sure that with the innovation agenda, it isn't just, so what do we take from with our Silicon Valley or our mindset there, but actually what can we be learning from the innovations taking place in those challenging areas? Because if necessity is the mother of invention, well, there's a lot of necessity that's been leading to a lot of great invention. So we need to make sure that this is a two-way flow.
Yeah, I totally agree. If I can jump in here, maybe if I can share an example just of one path of how I've seen foreign aid be catalytic and drive innovation. So one of the organizations that we supported from the lab at USAID was a company in Tanzania called OffGrid Electric. And what they do is provide household solar systems that are using a pay-as-you-go mechanism through mobile money, let people pay off their home solar system for a few cents a day over time. And this allows families who were using polluting kerosene but just didn't have the upfront capital to buy a home solar system to be able to afford it because they can pay it off over time. So 5 years ago, this was a brand new idea, very risky, not something the private sector would invest in, not something local governments would invest in. We gave OffGrid a $100,000 grant from Development Innovation Ventures to try out this new idea. It's a very small grant of $100,000. When they experimented with this and we started to see that, hey, it looks like it might work, we gave them $1 million to start building out some infrastructure and really be able to start running a business. Subsequently, as their business started thriving, we gave them a $5 million grant that was structured to look sort of like first loss debt that would help them raise debt from the private sector that really still, they hadn't been able to prove the track record yet that these people living at the bottom of the pyramid would really be able to pay off their loans over time. So now off this about $6 million or so of foreign aid, OffGrid has been able to raise over $100 million in debt and equity from private sources, right? And about half debt and half equity. And so this is an example of how using foreign aid was crucial. They never would have gotten off the ground without the foreign aid, but has leveraged dramatically more private sector funding, as well as has helped them develop a self-sustainable business model. And so I guess the challenge back to you, Robert, is I agree we need to increase foreign aid. I agree it's absolutely crucial. But the kinds of investments that we made in OffGrid are a tiny minority of the ways that foreign aid is used today. The majority of how foreign aid is used that I've seen feels like taking a spoon and trying to empty the ocean in terms of running programs that are good for the people that we're running the programs for, but so subscale to the need that are out there. And we're not going to be able to increase foreign aid sufficiently to really get to the size of the need. So how do we, at the same time as we're asking to increase the investment in foreign aid, also shift to the way that we're doing foreign aid so that it becomes more innovative and more catalytic?
So, and I think there's an opportunity and a danger there, because, so take Tanzania. That's a great example of a catalytic approach. There's another example that the IDRC and the former CETA did, which was looking at what were affecting children the most in terms of mortality rates and doing sentinel survey to understand what kids were dying from and how you could intervene more quickly to save their lives at a cost per capita of about $1. They were able to reduce child mortality by about 40%. So it was a very specific piece of research that was done that really unlocked ways to be more effective. So that was also kind of that catalytic element, but to put it in place, to actually provide that across that population required hundreds of millions of dollars of support over about 10 years. So there was the heavy lifting element to apply it. In Tanzania again, for the primary health education system to provide the context for economic growth, again, that has required billions of dollars of support over the last 10 years. And that's kind of the heavy lifting element. It's not as sexy and exciting as that catalytic stuff. I'd argue it's equally important. And so we need to make sure we have that mix. And if you look at the portfolio of where ODA can work, in a place like Tanzania, I think there's three. There's how do you catalyze the new ideas? How do you do the heavy lifting to provide the financing so that the basic social and governance is in place? And then how do you provide the governance context so that the systems of justice works, the rule of law works, and you provide a context where businesses can actually invest knowing that they can be treated appropriately. And I think you need that mix. My concern is we get so excited by that first one, we forget about the rest. It's like if you only focus on R&D and don't focus on the production, you need the balance. And I think if you put those in, then you can really have an effect. The other element I would say is, you know what, we've had some pretty big spoons and they've been emptying a lot of, not oceans, but if you think about poverty swamps. So the fact is, you know, if you look at the measures of poverty under the World Bank measure of poverty, 35 countries with about $3 billion people have actually been lifted out of low income into middle income through these programs. So my sense is, in some cases, that heavy lifting is expensive, but it does have mass effects across saving millions of lives, transforming hundreds of millions of people in the future. So I would not dismiss the massive impact we can have with ODA.
I would add one element, speaking from the private sector perspective. The private sector is not going to go into capacity building at the government level, creating favorable environments for business to do their job. So that's an area where ODA, I think, needs to remain. So whether it be to develop better governance rules, better legal frameworks, rule of law, etc., or business practices. So I think there is a strong complementarity here with ODA working at the macro, which is an area where you're never going to extract value that could justify private sector investment, even though you should not rule it out. But with the private sector and both public DFI type and purely private coming underneath there, the micro level. I guess the question that is being asked here, and I would ask to both of you, is what is that handoff between that ODA? Because I think we generally agree that that there is that even if we may disagree on the size or the application, but there is that need for the ODA presence. What is that optimal handoff, and how do you actually get to that catalyzing private sector resources? And from my perspective at this stage, I think there still is, it's a Canadian thing, the tale of two solitudes, which is, we try to speak the same language, but we never quite connect, which is the aid community is somewhat suspicious of the private sector. And this challenge, we can't use ODA to enrich people. And from the public and from the private sector perspective and investors is, well, I have some business requirements which need to be met in the opportunity I'm going to invest in. So how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And there's not, in my mind, there's not one answer. I mean, it's always, it depends. It depends on the solution you're trying to do, the place you're trying to do it, and so forth. What I would say, though, is it's critical in my mind that we always think when we're applying ODA of what's the end game. Absolutely agree with you, Robert, that there's various different stages that need to happen. But I think we're not always thinking about how do we get ourselves out of business. And I think we always need to keep that in mind. And again, the private sector isn't the only place to catalyze funding from. The domestic resources are far actually greater source of funding than the private sector, and particularly for areas like health and education, that's predominantly where you're going to find the funding coming from, and the existing funding is significant and could be much better applied. A great example of this is in Liberia right now. There's this fascinating experiment that's being run where the country of Liberia, sort of in their long recovery from civil war, has recognized that their schools aren't delivering sufficient education for their kids. A few years ago, none of the kids who graduated high school could pass the exam to enter college. Right? And so they realize there's a crisis in the education system. So what they've done is they've brought in 8 different players, both from the private sector and NGOs, to take over some of the public schools and run them with a very rigorous randomized control trial alongside to determine whether at the $50 a kid a year, any of these organizations could deliver better educational outcomes than the government was. And with the idea that if they are able to do so, that the government would hand over more and more of the schools to them. And so what the first year results have just come back, just in the last couple weeks, and showed that at least one of the players was able to double the educational outcomes. That means that in the year, kids got 2 years worth of schooling versus the kids in the public schools. And so, if this experiment continues to be successful, you can imagine Liberia taking advantage of some of these other players who are bringing in better solutions and leveraging the government funding from a very, very poor country like Liberia to deliver better solutions. So we have to look both to the private sector and to government to do so.
And I think there's a really important challenge and opportunity. There is this valley of neglect as countries go from being official development assistance recipients, very poor countries, and then you get into kind of less poor countries, but not yet really, really attractive countries, and they kind of get forgotten. So the development people leave, the foreign affairs folks aren't that interested, the trade commissioners don't have a role to play, and then 10 years later when you go, oh my gosh, at 7% growth, this country is now interesting, we've lost all those institutional and individual connections. So I think one of the real advantages with one of the potential opportunities of the global affairs integration with CETA and trade now being part of within global affairs is, can you actually have an ongoing relationship and more seamless handoffs? And I think one of the things one does need to do is be pretty ruthless about why you're applying official development assistance after countries reach a certain point. Because in a sense, it's easy to once you got a program going, it's easy to maintain it, but if it's successful, you should be to point, okay, well great, now they do have their own primary education system. Can they do domestic mobilization? Can we help them with their tax reform so they can do that themselves, so that we're ensuring that the ODA is being focused in the areas of greatest need, rather than just in the areas of greatest ongoing convenience for us to continue what we were doing before. So I think it is important to have that kind of a constructively ruthless mindset to say, where can we actually have the greatest impact with these instruments? And then if we do move out of ODA, how do we hand it over? And the handoffs traditionally have been really bad. So when we shifted out of India, we handed over very poorly. When we shifted a lot of our ODA programs out of China, it was a real challenge to maintain those relationships. And having this integrated approach, I think, would be a real opportunity for us.
I just would like to add that this is where research and evaluation can be really helpful. One thing that's been surprising to me is that very few countries, through their official development assistance arm, actually track what the private sector is doing so that they can collaborate more effectively. And we noticed just a few years ago, the OECD started collecting data on private flows. Prior to that, they actually didn't have a very good idea what the private sector, whether that's foreign firms, corporations, or NGOs were doing in a particular country. So I think having that data and the research allows that more seamless collaboration and handoff if necessary.
Well, and I'm curious to know, just to insert here with the moderator's privilege, but we often hear, for example, about Canadian mining companies that are in large parts of the third world or other major corporations. Is there a way to leverage that in private aid to hold it accountable, to check who the partners are, and to make sure where that money is being delivered to?
Yes, and that's a great example of where you could do catalytic stuff, but that requires a huge mindset shift here in Canada. It requires a mindset shift in the minds of certain executives, because almost every senior mining executive wants to do the right thing in terms of meeting the laws, but very few are determined to really do the optimal thing in terms of how do we really make a difference. It requires NGOs to be prepared to work with mining companies, and it's often much easier to have them as someone you condemn than someone you work with, because it's messy. And it requires the Canadian government to also see this as something which we'd engage in. All the pieces are there for us to actually have that as one of the incredible instruments for Canadian impact, because half the mining stocks of the world are on the TSX. And that would be, you don't need a lot of ODA to do that, but it does require different mindsets and different collaboration than we've had in the past.
There are actually some good stories there. There's, many of you in this room, I'm sure, know the Devonshire Initiative, which is a joint initiative of mining companies and NGOs to try and find joint solutions or joint ideas and activities in ensuring that mining projects have, minimize their adverse effects and maximize the positive effects. And it's a conversation that we, on an exploratory basis, have had with them. And the DFI does not intend to support the mining sector because it's not where it should be from our perspective. However, mining companies in many countries are the one Canadian presence and significant footprint with a lot of connections, good and bad. We need to recognize that. But what they do very often is that they're big clients of stuff, and instead of shipping it from Canada or elsewhere, they try and source it locally. Is there an opportunity there to use that presence of a mining company to develop a sustainable private sector that is not just dependent on the presence of the mine there, but can also develop a business that will be sustainable over time, even when the mining project closes down. So the whole supply chain of mining companies can have well managed, can have very beneficial effects. And well managed means look beyond the mine lifetime and try to develop businesses that are not just geared to delivering stuff cheaper to the mine, which would not be very sustainable once it packs up, but have a lasting presence.
Mercedes, you can share another session on that one.
It's a controversial question to ask, but Anne, I'm wondering too from you, you have this incredible experience at places like Google and in the Silicon Valley and with innovation and technology. Is there a way that kind of technology can be leveraged in terms of whether it's making people more aware of the ODA projects, of private aid? Is there a role for that that isn't just being decided in bureaucratic headquarters or aid companies, headquarters, NGOs, that democratizes it a little bit? Or is that unnecessary?
Absolutely. So technology plays into aid in so many different ways. I think a lot of times people think too quickly of technology as a panacea, and the reality is in the developing countries that we work in, typically the technology that's appropriate is usually 10 or 20-year-old technology, just because advanced technology is not diffused in those areas yet. And so a lot of times that's just not realistic. But in terms of engaging people in developed countries, absolutely, we're seeing a lot more advent of crowdfunding sites like Kiva and what's the other one? GoFundMe, yeah. So there's a lot of sites like this that are, WotC is a new one as well, that are finding ways to engage people individually more directly in their own giving, which I think is an exciting move. The thing I actually think is most exciting about technology, though, is the opportunity to use technology not so much to deliver solutions, because we often think of like, oh, let's just have an app to help farmers or whatever, but they often can't use these apps or don't have the smartphones to access them, but rather to use it for our own work in the development sector. That and the development sector is notoriously, a lot for funding reasons, has poor internal technology, right? We don't invest a lot in our internal technology system, so it leaves us blind a lot of times in terms of understanding our customers and understanding the characteristics of what's going on there. And technology can help dramatically here in really giving us visibility into ongoing data of how our programs are running, what's working, what's not working, and getting us the data intelligence to make adaptations and adjustments and learnings on a much, much faster cycle than we're traditionally able to do so on a midline or endline evaluation. So I actually think that's the biggest promise for technology and development today.
I would just add one thing in terms of democratization and openness and transparency. Another role technology can play is just providing a lot of this information for all of us to see. I know MacArthur Foundation has this $100 million Change Prize, where they're providing $100 million for an NGO that has a great solution in any area, whether it's climate change, global health. But one very exciting piece of this competition is that they will announce not just the winners, but also the people who didn't win the $100 million, but were finalists. And they'll have that database completely open access so that other funders, other researchers, other people working in this space can see those other grant applicants, and even if they didn't get the $100 million, they may find funding elsewhere. So I think that openness is also an opportunity, and so government can play a role in sharing what they're learning, so the private sector, the NGO sector can learn from not just the ones that won the prize or got the grant, but the ones who didn't as well, because there may be some that are quite close, but you didn't have enough in your budget to allocate. So I think that's also exciting.
And I think along those lines, another effort that I think is really exciting and interesting comes sort of from the tech world, even though it's not really a technology solution, is an organization called Give Directly that is known for doing unconditional cash transfers as a means of aid. And if you talk to them, they would say their goal is not to have everything be unconditional cash transfers, but their goal is actually to be a benchmark, to provide visibility into the effectiveness so that we can benchmark any program that we're running that we think might be more beneficial than cash against cash as a baseline, sort of like an index fund, right, in the stock market. And so I think, one of the things I think Silicon Valley is bringing as there's more and more engagement in global development is this rigor around, like, let's really measure what works best as opposed to use our emotions in determining what interventions to deploy.
Great. I want to remind everyone there is the poll still. If you haven't had a chance to vote, we are going to look at that at the end to see if opinions have moved a bit. So it's on your app. In the meantime, I want to move to some of the questions that we're seeing from the floor because they're very interesting. The number one question, and these are questions people are voting on, so this is the number one most popular question right now, is the 0.7% target for ODA still relevant?
We have, I think in Canada, lost the right to debate that. We are so far away from it. And we're using dismissal of 0.7 as a smokescreen to not look at the fact that we're well below half of 0.7. So I think a way to look at it would be, given all the different challenges and sources of financing, is there still an unmet need for the kind of financing that ODA alone can provide in refugee situations, in conflict-ridden societies, in fragile and least developed countries? And I think the argument would clearly be, yes, we still need more there. And not only would that help people directly, but it would create the conditions for all these other instruments to be most effective. So we need that booster rocket still. So if you say there's still a need, then you would say, is Canada doing its fair share even within what is being done now? And you'd say, well, on average, across the OECD, including Poland and the Czech Republic, they actually give more on average than we do. If we look at our like-minded countries we like to refer to ourselves as being part of, they give to 2 to 3 times per capita more than we do. Right now, we kind of spend on defense like Europeans and on development like Americans. So, the United States last year gave $105 per capita US in development. We gave 109. It's not a big enough difference for us to feel superior. The UK gave 500 per capita, the Norway gave 800. So we have a long way to go. And so I think what we should do is, I think 0.7, if you sort of say, well, what would you really need to meet that? But that may or may not be correct. It may be a little bit more or maybe a little bit less. What is clear is more needs to be done collectively. We're not even doing our fair share of what's being done now. So I would shift it from should we aim to 0.7 to should we aim to do better and significantly more as part of a mix, including getting our private sector engaged, getting our pensions funds involved to play a great role. Our diaspora could be even more involved, but making sure we step on ODA, I think that is as relevant as ever. Once we've done that, then in some future point, then we've earned the right to debate 0.7 again.
Anyone else want to respond to that question? I think he might have covered the waterfront there.
I have nothing to add to this. I think it's very well said. I would actually say that, and many of you might be aware that the OECD is trying to redefine the way ODA is calculated, and from my perspective, and I know I have a divergence from other DFIs on this, I'm not too keen to see DFI counted as ODA. I think we need to keep things clear. There's this notion of total official support for sustainable development, which could include private sector, which is great, but let's not lump it with ODA. So I'm completely with Robert, and I'm putting myself deliberately out of it.
Excellent.
Well, I noticed there's a couple of questions that seem a little bit similar to me, so I'm going to combine them a bit because I think they're getting at something that is an idea and a concern people have. When you're talking about the search for private development, does it allow the government off the hook to not have to meet that 0.7%, to not perhaps have to increase it if necessary? And the second part of that question to me would be, does it matter if the government can't meet the targets it has now that you'd like to see higher ones?
I would say the answer is no. The private sector and official development assistance are really clearly two very different things. The example I gave with humanitarian relief is a very good one. In our data, we see private donors moving in very quickly in response to humanitarian disasters. We don't necessarily see government aid moving as quickly to respond to those, simply because it takes longer. It's more difficult sometimes to coordinate. In the US, Congress has to authorize it before those flows can go, whereas remittances, private foundations, NGOs, some of them are already in those countries and can deliver very quickly. So these are clearly very different. They're often flowing to different countries. As we talked about, FDI tends to go to middle and higher income countries, whereas ODA tends to go to the lowest income countries in conflict regions, post-conflict regions. So I think what we need to understand is that, as we talked about, today's development landscape is very different. We have countries at very different levels of development with different needs. And we now have an array of tools that we didn't have before: blended finance, impact investing, crowdfunding. Many of these things did not exist 10 years ago. So it's really about what problem are we trying to solve, and what can we use from our toolkit to solve that problem. And some problems are clearly designed to use official development assistance, and others the private sector can play a role. And when we talk about the private sector, it's not just FDI, as I've mentioned. That landscape is quite complex. It includes foundations, global companies, and their CSR objectives, as well as remittances and the diaspora community. And that can be a resource in terms of new ideas and new approaches as well.
I would pick up on something you said, and really you've mentioned blended finance. Blended finance is actually not a new thing. It's being renovated and dusted off. But I think you made a very good point about the clarity of who plays what role and who needs to be where. And one of my concerns, and we've been involved in a lot of the conversations around blended finance, is for blended finance not to become blurry finance. I think you need to, in order for blended finance to work well, you need to come to the table with a very clear sense of what you as an organization, whether it's an ODA organization, private aid, whatever it is, with a very clear sense of what your goal is, what you're willing to do, and come to an agreement on that basis. Because what we see, the dynamic that we see very often is around the table, there is an assumption that the person across the table is going to do certain things. So, oh, you're a DFI, therefore you'll be, maybe cheaper. Well, maybe not. So you need to really understand what the other organizations that you're going to be working with need in order to be in the deal, and work on that basis. So I think it's a very good point, that clarity of roles, and what we're still missing is that spark there, which how do we effectively work together?
Yeah, and I agree with what both my panelists have said here. I think the answer is yes and, right? That it's not one versus the other. If we have a $2 to $3 trillion a year gap, we're certainly not going to make that up just with ODA. I think it's all of the above. And ODA is, I think, essential in terms of catalyzing, creating the enabling landscape for private sector to come in, and in other cases, fills gaps where the private sector isn't going to engage. So I think it's both.
One of the places where the government has pledged to engage with the Feminist International Policy is women. And for me, I always think of a woman I met in Niger who told me she was about 17 years old. She had multiple children already at that point. Her baby was blind from a parasite. Her husband was a jihadi who was obviously out of the house when we talked. Articulate, intelligent, raising these children, no opportunities. How do you execute a feminist policy, whether it's the government of Canada or whether it's privately, that deals with the women and children who suffer the most in the third world and in these developing countries?
Well, I think one of the things that the government announced in this last year around the sexual and reproductive health and rights for women, particularly adolescent girls and women, is absolutely essential, because one can talk about the empowerment of women, but if they are married often against their will very young and are unable to decide, whether and when and how many children they have, all these other things really don't matter that much. And it has traditionally been probably one of the biggest public policy failures in the development system. And with the Mexico City policy of the US administration now, it was in danger of getting worse. So actually, I think that's an example of where Canada has stepped up. There's a number of other areas that we've been talking about in terms of the basic education, the other elements, the technical schools, where Canada could also play a very important role with this. But those will require, in addition to the right focus and mindset, the right resources to be effective. One thought is when we look at the other instruments we have, including the private sector, including the EDC, can we put that same feminist overlay of women empowerment on what we're doing? So can Canadian corporations, we're talking about the mining sector, can they over time also become examples in the field of really empowering women? And I think that would be a future looking out, but those might be the kind of things we do where it becomes a whole of Canada and just not just a whole of government approach to this.
I'll pick up on that, and I saw one of the trending questions is about how can the DFI become more feminist. I'll jump right in the fire and say, is feminist, or ask the question, is feminist an adjective that's used to speak to a Canadian audience, or is it an adjective relevant worldwide? I don't know the answer to this. What I will certainly say is that women economic empowerment and giving opportunities for women is a theme that is here to stay beyond short-term political branding. And it is one that we certainly intend to make at the core, or to place at the core of what the DFI will do. I will be very clear here, I don't know exactly how we're going to do this yet. But the question I would ask, and I would certainly welcome, maybe not now, but in subsequent discussions, the answer to is that how do you bring the gender equality consideration into a private sector environment where the primary goal is to build sustainable businesses that will be there even beyond your presence there. So I think the ideal point that we're trying to find is what element of women empowerment are actually going to make businesses more successful. And there's a good body of intelligence on this. Women in management and women in certain positions will make your companies more competitive, more successful. That's the kind of dialogue that we need to engage, potentially us as a DFI with our clients and bringing partners to the table, which is, can we work with entrepreneurs in developing countries to show and help them build that stronger business, because their goal is business, stronger business presence and competitiveness by better empowering women. And it can be at different places. It can be ownership, it can be management, it can be work. I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know what the metrics around that are. It's one of the challenges that we're trying to tackle, but I really welcome the continuation of this conversation, which is long.
I would like to jump in here just to say that I think that's where research can be really helpful, especially in developing countries. So we now have a large body of research that shows that when women are educated, countries are more prosperous, countries are healthier. There's this basically development boom from investing in women and young girls. We also know there's a business case for investing in women, and I think what maybe we can do collectively is how to share that research with the private sector. Just a small anecdote, for International Women's Day, I would say I got more emails, congratulations, all kinds of things from Nigerian businesses, because they're recognizing that women are a huge part of their purchasing, their buying, all of the household goods are bought by women and so forth. So I think as companies start to recognize not just this business case, but the economic power that rests within women as consumers, and increasingly they're the ones that make financial decisions within their households globally, we're starting to see a shift. And I had to ask, I have two sisters in Nigeria, why is Nigeria celebrating International Women's Day? And in the US, I don't think I got a single email, text, tweet, anything about International Women's Day. And both sisters who work in the private sector said, Nigerian businesses have seen that women are most of their customers. And so they're changing to really market and target women. So all of them had ads, commercials, all kinds of activities around International Women's Day. So I think after a while, it's something that there's momentum. It's like a match near kerosene. It starts to catch fire. So I think we can certainly build on that. Yes.
Yeah. And just add one. I agree with everything you guys have said, and just to add one other dimension to this, in terms of like how to make a DFI feminist or a program, I think one of the things that, there's a program now at the UN Foundation called Data 2X, and it's really about how do we get gender disaggregated data, because a lot of times we're just flying blind. We don't know how well we're serving women, and oftentimes, as a result, we're not serving women as well. You know, I happen to have worked on issues around women and technology, and we found that women are dramatically underrepresented in terms of both owning mobile phones and having access to the internet. So when you're providing services that are, for example, through the internet, maybe twice as many men may have access to them as women, and we need to know those kind of things. And the same thing with any program, whether it's technology or not technology related, by tracking gender disaggregated data about both who we're reaching and how effectively we're reaching them, I think is an important baseline for us to have visibility to say, are we really serving women as well?
Well, we're coming up on our final 10 minutes, so I'm going to ask our panelists to sum up. We've heard some very interesting discussions about the different roles that different parts of aid, private, ODA, DFIs, remittances can play. All of it, obviously, in our context, is the question of how it contributes to development. And how it can best be applied and how it can be collaboratively applied. So I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to sum up their thoughts, not only on their own position, but on what they've heard from their fellow panelists today about how this can be used to make the world a better place.
You want me to start? So this has been a great discussion. It's really been a pleasure being a part of this panel. I think as we've all heard, I think all of us believe that ODA is essential and needs to increase, and the needs in the world are only increasing, and the gap is humongous. You know, I would just sort of wrap up by saying, absolutely we need to increase ODA. ODA is essential, and we also at the same time need to rethink how we deploy ODA to be relevant in the 21st century, because the world has changed dramatically since a lot of the programs that we have today are set up. And we do need to think about how to increasingly invest ODA in ways that drive better solutions to the problems we have, and are more catalytic in terms of bringing in not only private financing, but also local government financing.
Yeah, and I will pick up on this. And I said at the beginning that the DFI, we intend to be really partnership-based. Partnership is challenging because you need to you know, there's somewhere an element of compromise and meeting the other entities. So the partnering is going to be, of course, with the government of Canada under the umbrella of the international assistance policy. But there was a question earlier on how will the DFI work with the civil society and the organizations in this room. And the answer is, I don't know how, but I certainly will want to find solutions in that area, because you are collectively the eyes and ears of the Canadian community on the ground. As I said, we need that understanding. So to the extent that you are working with private sector entities, perhaps at an earlier stage than we would, we're really interested in what you see. And I've had a conversation with many of you, interested in what you see and see what opportunities is there for commercial financing or DFI financing to come following your intervention or concurrent with your intervention. These are conversations I look forward to having.
Yeah, no, I think this was a great kind of Canadian debate or Canadian dialectic where we end up agreeing with one another at the end. I mean, that's kind of how we try to make our country work. You sort of take it, and there is actually an element there that it is key that for some of the things I think ODA is still irreplaceable, and there's clearly an unmet need to provide those services and resources. The good news is if one does that, it then accelerates the ability to leverage the catalytic and to provide the catalytic growth for the private sector to make sure that when remittances are coming in, the governance and infrastructure is in place so they can be also most effective. And actually, as a result, you could actually accelerate the end of the need for ODA in that country, in that region, and eventually over the next 30 years globally. I mean, it's possible to imagine that on the 100th anniversary of the kind of the creation of international development assistance, which is one of the great creative, constructive instruments for good of the 20th century, that by about 2047 to 2050, so almost exactly 100 years after the Marshall Plan or the Colombo Plan, much of this will be done. And there'll still be need in humanitarian crisis, but many, many, many of these countries will actually be self-sufficient. But to do that, you actually need these different instruments to work together. And Canada actually has a moment to play that role. I think there's a rekindled interest in what Canada is doing internationally. I think with the integrated global affairs, with the new and exciting international assistance policy, we actually have these different pieces. What I would hate to see is the DFIs in the private sector being set against ODA as like, this is a new replacement, and we end up looking at this as a zero-sum trade-off game as opposed to a way to really, in a complementary fashion, come up with new synergies and accelerate the kind of development we were just talking about. That, I think, is our challenge and our opportunity here.
Yes. Yeah, it's hard to come after the three speakers here, but I'd like to say that I think the problems we face today are unprecedented. I can't remember the last time we had hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, just all back to back. It's hard to know where to concentrate because the problems are widespread. The Caribbean, Nigeria had a big flood, India, Pakistan. They're disasters, they're crises, but they're also real ongoing development needs throughout the global south and the rest of the world. So I think it's time to sort of step back and not say, do we need ODA, do we need the private sector? It's clear that we need all three sectors, perhaps, but to work together in a different way, to seek solutions that are root cause, not just basically Band-Aid solutions, but actually finding and solving and meeting these challenges, whether those are these humanitarian crises or the long-term ongoing development needs that aren't perhaps as sexy or as televised, but are still quite important. One of the perhaps more troubling issues is that we tend to repeat some of the same mistakes that we've made before. So if we can learn what worked or what didn't work, we can try to do it better, whether that's meeting humanitarian crises or solving development challenges. I think that the real opportunity here is to use this database of knowledge that we now have to create solutions that are more sustainable and will lead to improving lives for millions and billions of people around the world.
Well, certainly no silver bullet to very complicated situations all around the world, but a fascinating discussion where we've had an opportunity to learn about how these different flows can complement each other, what they can do, what they can't do, and lots of new ideas for moving forward. So I want to thank our panelists very much for their time and their brilliant ideas today.